Welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between biennial National Adaptation Forum events. Visit the National Adaptation Forum website to learn more about past forums, including our most recent gathering this past April 2019. We are beginning to plan for the 2021 forum, so please stay tuned for more information as details unfold. I'm Molly Johnson, one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar will focus on a tribal climate adaptation menu for Indigenous-led climate adaptation. Before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce feedback. If you're using a microphone voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute, even if you are listed as muted when logged in. We will have time after the presentation for question and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit any questions to the presenter. We will do our best to answer all of them, and you can also type questions into the chat box for us to pull from. Please use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We will help you address any problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees as a way of emphasizing a point heard during the presentation. We encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. We will be recording and posting the webinar in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. The webinar should be available online next week and can be viewed at www.cakex.org. The presentation will also be available online as PDFs in the EcoAdapt site at ecoadapt.org/webinars. Additionally, we wanted you to be aware that certification maintenance credits are available for the webinar today through the American Planning Association. You can evaluate the session through the CM search on the APA website. Please contact us if you have any questions about that. So I'm pleased to introduce the presenters for today's webinar. So first we have Rob Kroll, and Rob is a policy analyst in the Division of Intergovernmental Affairs at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission in Ozana, Wisconsin. His duties include coordination of GLIFLIC's climate change program and providing policy analysis and operational experience to the Enforcement Division. GLIFLIC's climate change program is focused on integrating Indigenous traditional, ecological, and experiential knowledge with scientific research in natural resources, climate adaptation for the benefit of its 11 Anishinaabe or Ojibwe member tribes. Thanks for being here, Rob. And we also have Sarah Smith with us today. Sarah is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation as a part of the Sustainable Development Institute. She is a direct descendant of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and holds a bachelor's degree in biology and First Nation studies from University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, as well as a Master of Science in Ecology from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Thank you, Sarah. Also, we have Stephen Handler with us. And Stephen is a climate change specialist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. His main role with the NIACF is to coordinate the Northwoods Climate Change Response Framework, which involves building partnerships, assessing climate change risks, and working with land managers and landowners to develop real-world projects to adapt and prepare for future change. So thanks to all three of you for being here. And with that, I will let Sarah kick us off.
Sigus Wahwegu, Sarah Smith Yungias, Oniotiaga Ni'i o Kalewagwaho Nuwagadoloda. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah Smith, and I'm going to start us off today on our presentation for the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to try to cover today and within the hour. So we'll go over introductions and introduce the TAM team. We'll cover adaptation menus and how they work. Then we'll introduce the TAM as well as the guiding principles. We'll get into some of the strategies and approaches that are in the menu. And then we'll finish up with some of the workshops and example projects that we've been working with. So this is Tribal Adaptation Menu Team, or we like to call ourselves the TAM team. So all the names you see in the circle are all the authors of the menu. And we decided to go this route instead of having like a first author and second author listed to show that we are all equal in this process and nobody was above one another when we were working on the menu and when we created it. At the bottom, you'll see some of the logos for the different organizations and tribes that were involved with this project. And these are just a few. We also don't have all the logos from the different tribes that helped to work on this as well, including tribes such as Lac du Flambeau, Menominee, Ehzhitwaad, Red Cliff. So this is a very diverse team. It includes tribes, intertribal organizations, federal partners, universities. So it was a really diverse mix of people. So this is just some of the menu team. This was actually in September when this was taken. So you can see some of the members here and members that aren't listed on the author page include members such as Jo, who's the little girl in the picture. Some of our team members would bring their children to our meetings and also to our workshops. And they're really integral into this process, not only just to help give us energy after lunch, but to remind us of why we are doing this. You know, looking at the 7 generations, thinking about them and also their children and their grandchildren and how this will affect them. And so, yeah, this is just a small group of us. It's hard to get all of us together at once, but this is just some of us. And I'll pass it over to Rob.
Okay, bonjour everyone. I guess before I start talking about climate change and tribal nations, I want to say just briefly, the title of the menu in Ojibwe and Menominee is Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, which means literally doing something the Anishinaabe way. But as with most indigenous languages, there are often deeper layers of meaning, and the idea behind this really is doing this the original or the first way. So when we think about climate change and tribes, it's a very broad topic that we could actually talk about for the entire hour and more. So we're just going to touch on a couple things briefly that have a bearing on why the menu was created and why it was created the way it was. So this slide shows some beach erosion on Lake Superior. Okay, well, we're on the next slide. Anyway, we're talking about tribal nations. Realize that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So when we're talking about climate change impacts to tribal nations, realize that there are 573 federally recognized tribes and tribal groups, 60 state recognized tribes, and countless tribes that have been disenfranchised by government policy and action. Each one of them have their own climate change story, and it's not our place to tell those stories. However, when we think about tribes that have a land base, a reservation, tribal homeland, or treaty ceded territory, they're vulnerable to climate change in all the same ways as any other community. Things like infrastructure, roads and bridges. These slides here are from the Bad River Reservation in Odena, Wisconsin, back in 2016. Massive 1,000-year flood basically cut off the reservation for a couple weeks. Supplies were having to be flown in on helicopters, and medical patients were having to be flown out. So we realized that a lot of climate change impacts tribal communities are going to be the same as communities in other places. However, because of location and socioeconomic, often on the front lines of the climate crisis. So another thing we think about is natural resources. And natural resources which tribal people continue to rely upon for food, medicine, and cultural purposes, as they have since time immemorial. And these resources are vulnerable to climate change as well. This slide is from our Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission vulnerability assessment, and it indicates some of the most vulnerable species that we have assessed to date, such as Menominee or wild rice, wabouge or snowshoe hare, moose, white cedar, walleye, all species which we were directed by our 11 tribes to research because they're species which they rely upon for daily life, for medicine, for ceremony. In addition, these non-human beings are also viewed as elders and relatives and teachers with whom people have had long-term reciprocal relationships from time immemorial. And this is obviously a paradigm shift from the dominant perspective of these beings being resources. Next. So briefly, we'll talk about wild rice. It was listed as the most vulnerable species in our glyphic vulnerability assessment. As you can see from the slide, it is impacted by a lot of things, not just climate change. Human land use changes, limited ability to disperse. It's an aquatic annual grain, and with heavy seeds, so it's not something that's easily carried by birds or blown in the wind. It's adapted to cold or cool environments. It requires particular hydrological regime. It's susceptible to disturbance, pathogens, particularly when conditions get warmer, dependent on ice and snow, and it lacks genetic variation. Menominee is integral to the Anishinaabe worldview. It's the subject of their migration story. People originally lived on the East Coast and followed prophecy to the place where food grows on the water. That food was wild rice. It's used in ceremony. It's used as a daily foodstuff. It's used in feasts and at powwows, and it's difficult to separate wild rice from the cultural and worldview of Ojibwe people. Next. So then we realized that culturally important beings are moving or shifting ranges or disappearing due to climate change. At the same time, tribal homelands, reservations, and treaty ceded territories are fixed in place. And the loss of access to culturally important beings and the reciprocal relationships that have been maintained since time immemorial is an existential threat to Indigenous culture and community. And when adapting to climate change, actions must be culturally appropriate and community supported. And now we're going to Stephen.
Okay, folks, so now I kind of want to provide a little bit of context as to the overall purpose and structure of an adaptation menu, in case this is a new topic for you and you're wondering how all of these ideas actually appear in the document and how we hope to help people work with a range of adaptation concepts. Next. So the foundation for this adaptation menu framework for structuring climate adaptation concepts really comes from a document that was put together in 2012 called the Forest Adaptation Resources. This is something that my coworkers at NIAX assembled before I actually started at NIAX. And the idea was that actors in the forestry community were starting to get a handle on climate change vulnerability information, but they were asking for more resources and more guidance on how to help forests adapt to change. Now, importantly, what they did not want was recommendations and prescriptions on how exactly they were supposed to help their forests adapt. Instead, what they really wanted was something flexible, something organized with a lot of good suggestions. So that's really the guiding vision that went into this product. Next. Now, within the Forest Adaptation Resources document, the first part that you will find is a thought process. What we call the Adaptation Workbook is really a structured sequence of questions to help a land manager or a resource manager or a landowner figure out how climate change risk might affect them personally in a specific place, and to develop their own custom-built adaptation plan. So what you'll find in this adaptation workbook is not rocket science, but it's a sequence of 5 steps around these basic ideas of defining where you are and what you're trying to accomplish on the land, what are climate change risks for that particular place, and how might a particular place have higher or lower climate change vulnerability than neighboring places on the landscape. The third step is to take a hard look at your management objectives that you started with and try to come to terms with whether or not you think those objectives are still feasible given climate change risks. The fourth step then becomes brainstorming many different ways to help adapt and prepare for change. And then finally, the fifth step of this adaptation workbook asks you to come up with some ideas about how to monitor and evaluate your effectiveness as you go forward through time. So that's the overall structure of how we have helped land managers and landowners think about climate change adaptation. Next. The other half of the Forest Adaptation Resources document is actually a forest adaptation menu. And this was the first instance, the first time that NIAX tried to assemble an adaptation menu. And basically, it is kind of like what it sounds. It is a collection of plausible adaptation actions that are specific to a discipline. So the first forest adaptation menu contained mostly silviculture and forest management kinds of ideas, because that was the audience we were writing for. Just like you might walk into an Italian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant, you generally expect that menu to kind of cover a certain type of content. And so we try to write these menus in a way that really reflects the audience's needs and expectations. Next. Next again. Great. The other thing that is important to know about these adaptation menus is that their structure, I think, is vital to working with them, and I think it's also vital to making them useful. So initially, when we started working on forest adaptation and looking through the literature on the guidance and recommendations that were published on adaptation, you tend to find a huge mix of concepts and ideas really batched together sometimes in a way that is confusing. So you might find large conceptual ideas like manage for connectivity across large landscapes, right next to more tactical ideas like, providing a range of crossing opportunities for streams to accommodate different water levels. And that can be tough for a manager to deal with when, ideas are kind of presented without a respect to scale or scope. So really, in these adaptation menus, we try to provide a hierarchy that is useful. And I'll go into what that hierarchy means in a few seconds. And then next slide. The last thing I'll say about these menus is that we attempt to be as thorough and comprehensive as possible. Many times these adaptation menus are based on say a search of the scientific literature or extensive interviews with professionals working in that field. So we try to go all the way from appetizers to desserts to brunch cocktails in the same menu. Even though some of those ideas might be opposing, you might not show up at a restaurant looking for dessert and cocktails, but we want to give people the full range of options that they have for adaptation so that they can pick and choose what is most appropriate for their situation. Next slide. Okay, and a couple of things that have worked well with these adaptation menus. I mentioned the structure earlier, and I'll explain that quickly here. So we all are talking in the same language. We define adaptation in different tiers of activity. The highest tier in our way of thinking about it is that you have very few large adaptation options. You might think of 3 or maybe 4 of these, like resist change or encourage a major transition. Okay, so these are kind of the 30,000-foot, very conceptual attitudes towards climate change adaptation. So in this instance, I'm highlighting resistance as one potential option that a manager could come into a project thinking about, that this is a place to try to hold the line and play defense against change. Next slide. We realize that those large and fuzzy options are actually a long way from the guidance that managers are looking for. So the adaptation menus are really structured around the next 2 tiers of thinking, strategies and approaches. And so what we try to do is, strategies are still high-level concepts. So I'm showing you an example from the Tribal Adaptation menu here. Our strategy 4 is sustain fundamental ecological and cultural functions. That kind of gives you a flavor. It's still connected to this resistance idea from the option up above, but it is much more specific. And then next slide. Within each strategy in the menu, I think there are something like 12 or 13 strategies in the Tribal Adaptation menu. Underneath each strategy, you might find 5 or 10 more specific approaches. So within that strategy 4, we have approach 4.5, revitalize and maintain Anishinaabe and cultural use of ishkode or fire as a stewardship tool. Okay, so a much more distinct idea on how you would actually pursue strategy 4. And then this is meant to be a jumping off point for managers. Okay, we stop at approaches, and the idea is that an individual manager takes that idea and carries it forward to flesh out the how, when, where, why, to make it a tactic that you could implement for adaptation. Next slide. Yeah, so in this case, thinking about traditional use of fire, applying prescribed burns to marsh habitats is an idea that has come up in some of our workshops. Okay, next slide. The other advantage of these adaptation menus and their structure is that they help to clarify the intent of why you might pursue a particular action. So because the more discrete ideas, the approaches and tactics are connected to the larger ideas, the options and strategies, it helps communicate why you're doing the small things or the distinct things. And if you already come in with a tactic in mind, you can work the other way up the menu and figure out, well, how does this tactical level idea I have relate to some of the larger concepts on adaptation? So it's kind of a two-way street to help communicate the intent of adaptation. Next slide. Also, we found that it's really helpful to have one collection of adaptation ideas, especially when you're working in groups between multiple agencies, between different backgrounds and perspectives. It helps people to have a consistent framework and a consistent language on adaptation. So you can express ideas and say, oh no, I'm thinking of this on the menu. This is what I'm trying to say. I see that your idea is related to this. Here's how they can be blended. Yeah, so it's just nice to have a common point of reference. Next slide. And then finally, these menus are mostly about boosting creativity. So like I mentioned, we try to have a very wide collection of adaptation ideas, and we hope that we're presenting people with things that they have not considered before and that might be a little outside their comfort zones. So these can be challenging, and they're meant to kind of stimulate creativity in new and interesting ways. Next slide. Great. I'll hand it off now.
So thinking about all of that, I'm going to talk about how the Tribal Adaptation Menu began. So next slide. So the inception of the Tribal Adaptation Menu started back in the spring of 2017, when some of our TAM team members attended one of the workshops put on by NIAX, using their forested watersheds menu. So two of our members are in this picture here, Melanie Montana, who's in the very top middle, and then Tansy Moore, who's on the right. And so they were working on a project at this workshop focused on wildlife restoration. And while they were there, they realized that although this menu was really great, it was missing something, and it was this need for Indigenous perspectives. Next slide. So these adaptation menus primarily have been very reflective of more of this Western science, resource-centric perspective. And the need was to create a menu that was reflective of Indigenous knowledge and more this kin-centric perspective. So instead of viewing species as just resources, viewing them as our relatives, like it is in Indigenous knowledge and ways of thinking about it. So the new menu is based on an Indigenous way of decision making and conduct, and engaging in those Indigenous sciences and knowledge. And there's a trend now for Eurocentric science to look at Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous science to help with their management, which has been, foundations for tribes for millennia and how we go about doing what we do on the land. Next slide. And so this tribal adaptation menu is primarily developed for the use in Indigenous communities, mainly for natural resource professionals, but also with non-Indigenous partners as well. So that can include people like Forest Service, CNR, universities. And so this menu is to help bridge communication barriers for those non-tribal people and organizations who are interested in Indigenous approaches and understanding values and needs of tribal communities. And so the menu itself can be used across numerous ecosystems and scales, management goals and values. Next slide. And so this menu, the Tribal Adaptation Menu, is kind of just our first edition or first version. It's based primarily on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, language, culture, and values, which are all integrated into the menu. And it's intentionally designed to be adaptable for other Indigenous communities, for them to incorporate their language, their knowledge, their culture, and their values. So this is just kind of an example of how other tribes can use it. Next slide. And so something that's different from the other adaptation menus are these guiding principles. And I think Molly was going to include a link in the chat box if people wanted to pull it up while I'm going through this. But this is something we have at the beginning of our document, and it provides a framework to integrate Indigenous and traditional knowledge, language, culture into the adaptation planning process. And it talks about things like community engagement, sort of this decolonizing scientific research and methodologies and application in Indigenous communities, and in those co-management areas like ceded territories. And just like the menu itself, these guiding principles can be adapted by the different tribes based on their values. So although this menu is based primarily on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, those tribes themselves may have different values and culture and language that they want to include in the menu. And that way, tribes can fit it for their value and their language. Next slide. And so in the guiding principles, it talks about things like the importance of human and non-human relationships. So recognizing that the natural world is full of our teachers and our elders. Based on our teachings and stories, humans were put last on Earth. And so everything else are our teachers. So that includes the plants, the animals, the waters. So recognizing that importance. It includes cultural paradigms, and this especially can be adapted tribe to tribe on what they would like to highlight. Community engagement and decision making is mentioned in there. And then also how to go about ending a project and disseminating information. And really keeping in mind when working with tribes, who owns that information, what knowledge and information can be shared, and which knowledges shouldn't be shared to certain people. So really thinking about that. Next slide. And so Indigenous perspectives call for observation and recognizing and learning from our first teachers. So like I mentioned, our elders, so our plants and our animals. And adaptation going about with responsibility and reciprocity to all of our relations. And it's a different perspective than the Western management, where it in Western science it tends to emphasize control and management of these resources, so these non-sentient beings. And so this menu itself is a different perspective on that. Next slide. So our menu really touches on respect, reciprocity, and relationships. So thinking about the use of our relatives, our decision making was mainly communal and based on consensus, whereas today's management and decision making is mainly made from an individual or institutionalized way of going about it. And this menu, for example, was based on consensus. And so if there was something in the menu when we were going through it that didn't fit well with somebody, we would take the time to talk about it and go over it more in detail. And I'll talk about an example of that a little bit later in the slides. But everything we put in the menu was based on the consensus of our group. Next slide. So I'm going to talk real briefly about a few strategies and approaches that I pulled from the menu just to kind of give you an example of what that looks like. So next slide. So thinking about how it differs from the fourth adaptation menu, we pulled these two strategies just as an example on how they differ. And so in the fourth adaptation menu, there's strategy 9, which is facilitate community adjustments through species transition. And an approach under that would be to introduce species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And so something that's really similar in the tribal adaptation menu, but also slightly different, is strategy 11, which is encourage community adjustments and transition while maintaining reciprocity and balance. And so an example approach of that would be to seek out and share traditional and cultural knowledge of potential new beings from tribal communities where those beings are currently native. And this could go vice versa as well, sharing information with those tribal communities or even First Nations that are north of us. When thinking about species transitioning and recognizing that we need to be communicating with both those south of us and north of us, even if there's those political borders of the US and Canada, being able to share that knowledge with each other. And so next slide. This is just a brief outline of the different strategies that are in the menu. So there are 14 overall, and I'll go through a few of them real quickly with you today. So next slide. The first 3 that I want to touch on are strategies 1 through 3, and these we thought were really important to have in the very beginning of the menu. So strategy 1 talks about considering cultural practices and seeking spiritual guidance. So this could be consulting with knowledge holders, community members, elders, making sure our practices are mindful and based on reciprocity and respect. And then strategy 2 is a little bit different from sort of the Western perspective of learning from beings in natural communities as they respond to changing conditions over time. So this thought of kind of doing nothing is doing something. And so that's actually one of the last strategies we came up with to put in there, which is really different from strategies that talk about maybe managing after a disturbance and revegetating right away. So kind of like how Stephen said, there are contradicting strategies and approaches in the menu, but it's meant to be like that. And then strategy 3 really hits on tribal engagement. And so this could be things of like language revitalization programs, youth programs, environmental education, communicating opportunities for use of tribal and public lands. So these are the first 3 strategies that we have in there. And then, like Stephen mentioned, under each approach, we have a few example tactics as well. So next slide. And the other strategy I wanted to touch on real briefly is strategy 5, mainly looking at strategy or approach 5.2. So like I said, we came to everything in this menu based on consensus. And so 5.2 is maintain and improve the ability of communities to balance the effects of non-local beings, or in sort of the Western perspective would be invasive species. So this is something we talked about for pretty much an entire day, because we didn't, as a group, like the term invasive species, because it is so derogatory towards them and very negative. And so these invasive species, they're just going about what they were told based on their original instructions. They're just in a different place. And it really isn't their fault that they don't have the same checks and balances as they do from where they came from. So really changing that perception of invasive species, instead of, going to war with them, but thinking about, well, maybe they can contribute to the community, or maybe there's a use for them that we just haven't realized yet. So next slide. So those are just examples on the approaches and strategies that are in the menu. And like I said, there are 14 strategies overall. So you can take a look at them yourself, see what all is in there. But I'll turn it back over to Rob.
Okay, so the first question that we get asked most of the time when we go out to do presentations or talk to people about the menu is, where can I go to see a write-up of a project that was actually done using the menu? And unfortunately, we're not at that point yet. Next slide. So since January of 2019, we've done 4 workshops using the menu, using the Adaptation Workbook and menu process. These are 2.5-day workshops where participants come, they bring projects from their community or from their agency, and they work in teams to go through the workbook and menu process. And these typically are natural resource projects, but they aren't all natural resource projects. And the menu has actually accommodated things like infrastructure projects, emergency planning. So next slide. First workshop we did was in Cloquet, Minnesota. It was back in January before the menu was even released. We had a number of different tribal agencies there, most from Minnesota, some from Wisconsin, one from Oklahoma, and one from one of the Lakota communities. Some of the projects that we saw there, tribal wetland restoration from the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma. Some of our Glyphwick folks were working on paper birch habitat and restoration. And folks from Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, were working on forest management using cultural fire to enhance moose habitat. The tribal wetland restoration project is actually in process now and will be written up and will be available on the NIAC's website at forestadaptation.org, which we may get to mention a little bit later in the presentation. Next. Our second workshop was in Bay Mills, Michigan. The photograph there is actually a poster. Part of the workshop process is creating posters that reflect the entire workshop process, the entire workbook process, and how the menu was used. So some of our projects there, Great Lakes Coastal Marsh and Manuma Restoration with the Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians, Cedar Restoration with Bay Mills, USDA Forest Service folks were there and were working on road and stream crossings on the Hiawatha National Forest. And Bay Mills Community College had a team that came and were working on leak restoration in and around the Bay Mills community. And I believe several of those projects are also in process. Next. A third workshop was at the College of Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. Tribes there included the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, the Ho-Chunk Nation, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, and projects including sea level rise preparation, creating an Indigenous focused Wisconsin Master Naturalist class, and cranberry restoration. Another project from that workshop is actually going to be creating interpretive materials for a vulnerability assessment done by the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in Wisconsin. That project is in process as well, and when it's complete, will be written up. Next. And the fourth workshop that we did was actually in Mohawk Territory in Akwesasne on the New York-Canada border. This was the first workshop that used two menus, the Forest Adaptation Menu and the TAM, and was also the first workshop that was done outside of the greater Midwest area, where we had tribes bringing in their language and their culture and using it with the Tribal Adaptation Menu, and it was a very good fit. Some of those projects included preparation for the emerald ash borer and black ash, culturally appropriate invasive species control or non-local being control, and critical infrastructure planning. So the menu's been validated on not just natural resource projects, and we do have projects that are in process that will be available as case studies in the future. Next slide.
Okay, this is Stephen again, and I guess the last thing we wanted to leave you all with today, kind of like Rob mentioned, Dibaginjigaadeg, Anishinaabe, Ezhitwaad is ready to kind of move beyond the territory where we have designed it and tested it. So we mentioned that this was built mostly with Menominee and Ojibwe traditions, languages, and perspectives in mind. We have started testing it with other tribes and communities from around the country, and we know that it should be tailored and customized for use in more broadly diverse communities. So we're wondering, how best can we facilitate that? How can we help tribes and Native communities from around the country take the tool and customize it for their own use? And then related to that, we have always imagined the Tribal Adaptation Menu being a communications tool between tribal and non-tribal organizations and people. And so if you have ideas on that about how to use this kind of product as a communication and collaboration tool, we would also love to hear that. So with that, I think we're done with our slides. Look at us. And we are wide open for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen, Sarah, and Rob for your presentation. And it looks like we have many fantastic questions. So I think if it's all right with everyone, just putting it out there so I don't have to interrupt you guys. We will likely be going over time, but everyone that needs to jump off at the close, feel free. And I will ask my colleague, Tara Johnson, who works with me at EcoAdapt, to read off some of the questions that we got.
Sure. Thanks, Molly. Thanks to all our presenters for this really fascinating presentation. And thanks to our attendees for all the really awesome questions. We've got a number coming in, so I'll just start with the first one. This one is from Robin Cox. I am interested in your perspectives on what skills and knowledge, competency someone working with adaptation within Indigenous tribal communities would require to work effectively and in culturally appropriate and sensitive ways. So,
that's a really good question. Yeah. From my perspective, I am not a tribal member, and I'm actually relatively new in my position. This is Rob. So as was noted early on, my background is in environmental law and policy. I have a law enforcement background. But I think the skills and competencies that have served me the best over the past year and a half have been the ability to listen, the ability to create relationships, and the ability to be open to people who view the world in a way that may be considerably different than the one in which I was brought up in and trained in.
Great, thank you. Just because we're short on time, I'm going to keep going on to our next question from Dominic Sig. How did the research team approach knowledge holders? How were things like Indigenous law, relationships to teachers and relatives, and spiritually incorporated into the research and in a way that could be understood by non-Indigenous peoples?
That's a really good question. I don't know if Rob, you wanted to take this question, because I feel like Glifwick had a lot more background on that, working with knowledge holders in their communities. Part of our menu team was Melanie Montana, who is the tribal or the traditional ecological knowledge specialist, and she goes into communities to do interviews, to collect traditional knowledge and work with those knowledge holders. And so she was able to bring her perspectives and her knowledge from that. I would say for me personally, what I've been doing in my career and my education, I was able to bring my knowledge and background working with Midwestern communities into that as well. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, Rob, because it was shared with the Glifwick tribes before it was published.
That's true. So the guiding principle section does contain the guidance that we use here at Glifwick when we're going out to seek traditional knowledge and trying to do it in a way that's culturally appropriate and culturally responsible. We did do some validation with the menu with elders and also the tribal historic preservation officers from our 11 Ojibwe tribes that make up Glifwick, where we sent the drafts out and then went and gave the elders tobacco and asked them for their impressions and opinions before we published the menu. So it was validated in that way.
This is Stephen, just to chime in on that. I think part of the question was also about how did we try to write these things in a way that was accessible to a variety of audiences, and that was a situation where it was really helpful to have a diverse team of folks sitting around the table and batting these ideas around. We had many situations where someone would come in with an idea, maybe specific to forestry or specific to watershed management or specific to wildlife management, or come the other direction and come with an idea that was kind of a fundamental perspective from Ojibwe or Menominee teaching, and we would have to kind of sit with those ideas and each kind of take different turns of putting those words in our mouths and seeing how we might express it and modify that and modify it again. So I don't know, that process of sharing and revising each other's ideas in a kind of a non-confrontational and an understanding sort of way was really helpful, and I hope the final product is accessible to a wide variety because of that.
Great, thank you all. So our next question comes from Ricky Williams. Have climate adaptation plans typically been tribe initiated, or have efforts typically been led by consultant, state, or other organizations?
In our workshops, most of them have been tribally initiated. Some have come in with partner agencies, and some non-tribal agencies have come in out of a desire to be able to work with their tribal partners more effectively.
Great, thank you. Moving on, our next question comes from Maggie Savreddy. I hope I'm saying your last name right. How does the menu interconnect with emergency management agencies? They often have quite different practices and senses of time.
Emergency management agencies weren't necessarily the target audience for the menu. We had one emergency planner who came to the workshop at Bay Mills, and another emergency management person at the workshop in Akwesasne. both of whom were able to use the menu to help them better refine, I think, their relationship with Indigenous communities. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess that is, you know, I don't know if we said this at the outset, but that is one of the limits of this version of the tribal adaptation menu. Is it's mostly kind of working with ecosystems and natural resources management. That's generally the flavor. So more of those engineering ideas probably aren't expressed, or kind of the more infrastructure heavy ideas might not be captured in here.
Yeah, and I would say that we do cover infrastructure just a little bit in one of the strategies towards the end of the menu. So working at our last workshop in Menominee with the Miccosukee tribe, dealing with sea level rise and preparedness. Obviously, that wasn't something we have in the menu specifically because we're in the Great Lakes region. So dealing with that kind of emergency preparedness was really different to work with. But it wasn't something that the menu couldn't help with. So yeah, even though it wasn't directly stated in there, it was still able to help with their project.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Jessica Leclerc. It seems like the town could have some powerful health or mental health benefits for communities. Are you partnering with health or public health / community health / tribal health providers in the development, implementation, and or evaluation of the TAM?
Well, I did a webinar with the Network for Public Health not too long ago regarding the TAM, and there was interest in that community. It's not a initial focus as we were talking about with emergency management, but because a lot of the factors that are affected by climate change in Native communities have a direct impact on public health and mental health. It's definitely a partnership I think we need to explore in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just because this is, you know, like our first edition, there are definitely areas like mental health and health in general that could be included in future menus. And also things like agriculture gets brought up too, and food sovereignty. So yeah, I think it'd be really great to have that in another menu.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to try to get 2 more questions in. I think Alex just said we're going to share the webinar recording and the contact information of everyone to follow up with any further questions, but just because we're a little bit over, we're going to just try to wrap up really quickly. So the next question, do you have any sense of how aware tribes around the country are of TAM?
From my perspective, I think it's growing, especially since we've been doing these workshops and getting the word out that way, but also on different mailing lists with like ITEP, the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, and other listservs. And then back in September, that photo we showed in the beginning was actually an award that the team got for climate adaptation, and it was a national award. So I think the message is getting out there, and we've been seeing that, especially with the last workshop, we had a great number of tribes coming from outside of our region. So like Florida, Maine, California, North Carolina, and then yeah, I think the word is getting out there, which is really great to hear. especially when we look at like registration for these workshops too. And then all the presentation asks that we've been doing. I know there was one that Rob did that was up in Canada, so it's kind of going internationally recognized as well.
Awesome, that's so awesome to hear. We've got one more question we're going to do, and then I think Molly's going to wrap up for us. So this one comes from Kristen Baker. Do you have any insight to tribal input in energy resiliency?
I think that's, go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I think we're all kind of catching our breath on that one. This is Stephen. I haven't worked directly on that, but I would say some of the same principles might apply in terms of recognizing autonomy that tribes and tribal communities have to make decisions about what's best for them. And then also, different tribes have different ways of expressing it, but this idea of looking ahead to future generations and trying to anticipate as best as you can what those needs are going to be at that time and how your decisions today might affect those needs.
I think the other side of that coin is tribes realizing that while having partners is great, at the end of the day, they're sovereign nations and they need to be able to rely upon themselves, and that includes sort of things like energy sovereignty as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. This is Molly again. And I just wanted to give one more chance for our presenters. If you guys have any final words you wanted to share with everyone to close up. I can start with Sarah, I guess.
I just wanted to say, Yongo, thank you all for jumping on this webinar and taking the time out of your day. And hopefully it's been able to shift some perspectives for those maybe not working in tribal communities on different ways of thinking about our natural resources and our relatives. So I'll just say that.
Okay, Stephen?
That was really well said. Thanks, and please do contact us if you have ideas on how this tribal adaptation menu might be tailored to work in your community or with communities you partner with, or if you just have ideas on how to make it more accessible.
I just wanted to say, thank you very much to everybody who asked such good and thought-provoking questions, and for hanging in with us.
Thanks, and thanks to our presenters once again, Rob Kroll, Sarah Smith, and Stephen Handler, for all of your work and for sharing it with us today. And also thanks to all of our listeners who joined us today, and we'll be sending out a recording of this presentation within the next week to everyone. And feel free to point any colleagues who couldn't attend today's broadcast to the recorded version. It will be posted on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, otherwise known as CAKE, and that can be found at www.cakex.org. Which is also home to hundreds of other adaptation resources, case studies that relate to the panelists today. And so just for reference for our National Adaptation Forum webinar series, we host them quarterly, And if you would like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering with us, let us know. You'll have the opportunity to in the post webinar survey, as well as you can always email info@nationaladaptationforum.org. And we post our announcements for webinars on our social media pages, as well as on our website, www.nationaladaptationforum.org. So thank you all for joining us, and we will also send out, Alex thankfully shared the contact information for our panelists, so feel free to contact them, but we also will pass along any other questions directly to them to get their responses. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day, and thanks again.
Well, thanks everyone.